Three Quarters from Heaven, Part 2, Chapter 6, George's Greed. I awoke to the chilling feeling of a wet cloth on my forehead. I bursted up to find Georges sitting in a chair in front of me, a dustpan full of wood pieces in his hand. He also looked furious. "What in the name of God were you thinking?" Georges screamed, laying the pan down on the table. "What? Huh?" I muttered, my head spinning. "Calling them cannibals, you idiot! We may never be able to go back," Georges yelled. He got up from his chair and helped me up. "I'm sorry, I wasn't thinking, I guess," I replied, holding my head. "That's right, you weren't," Georges snapped. "Now my whole plan may be a waste." "I'm sorry, Wait, what plan?" I asked, wiping the blood off the cuts on my cheek. "I have a plan to own that earth, and to become king," Georges said, smiling. "What? How are you going to do that?" I asked. My legs were starting to buckle, so I lifted myself up to the counter. "I think that if I make an offer to the king of the Shadow Earth, I may be able to take his place on the throne," Georges explained. "What? That's stupid," I exclaimed. "What would you give him?" "Ownership of Earth," he said, a smile creeping across his face. "What? The king has an enormous army that can take over our world in an instant. It's a lot better than the Shadow Earth, and I think the king will be most intrigued," Georges said. "What do I care what happens to this world when I'll be ruling the Shadow one?" "Why do you want the Shadow Earth?" I asked simply. "I'm sick of this world, but this other Earth is simpler." "I think you're crazy," I exclaimed. "I think you should take those stones and smash them. That world is too dangerous." "They get that way when you're ignorant and stupid, Jim," Georges said. "So, are you with me, or are you going to stay here and be in the Shadow King's rule?" "My way will be a lot better." I just sat there, stunned. I didn't know what to say. Obviously, Georges was lost in his own forest of greed. He was talking crazy. The people on that world were definitely hostile. There was no way around it. I got up suddenly, just wanting to run out of George's door, but I felt lightheaded and fell forward into George's arms. I once again fell into sleep. When I did finally wake up, I would have wished I was still asleep. I woke up in George's bedroom, the blankets pulled up to my bandaged chin. I bolted up and strided out into the kitchen, where I found the 3 stones right next to the cedar jewelry box. A note was lying right next to the stones. The note read, "Jim, sorry, but I went back to the Shadow Earth to see how bad we look there. I also want to see if I can get some kind of appointment with King Jador. Joe's coming over. Once he comes, show him into the Shadow World and meet me at Dorft Landsky if I haven't already come back. Georges." I put down the note and hesitated. I then put all my attention to the cedar box, which seemed to beckon me forwards, and call my name and mock me at the same time. I had a sudden burst of hunger, and I fumbled with the box. Locked. But as I shook it, I could hear something metal and solid clinking around in there. It also sounded pretty big. I put the box down, and I looked up at the stones that were evenly spaced so they wouldn't set off. I remembered George's and his evil grin and his plan to take over that world that horrifyingly mirrors ours. George's plan was for evil, and there was only one way to end this. If George's wanted to stay there, so be it. I rooted around inside George's drawers, and I found a hammer. I walked over to the painted stones and raised the tool. I wanted to end this before it all started. Chapter 7, The Pit. I brought down the hammer with all my might. Its steel head only a blur of gray. I was blinking my eyes so I didn't see it hit, but I felt the hammer strike the solid rock. The hammer then shot backwards like it had hit a shock spring instead of a stone. The hammer flew out of my hands and smashed through the kitchen window. I stood there stunned, the stone unscathed, without even a chip of paint peeled off its surface. I sat down on a chair and stared at the stones. They were evil, I had a feeling, but I was kind of glad I hadn't destroyed the stones because George's was my best friend. Maybe there was a way to talk him out of this. Then the doorbell rang and I jumped for the door. Joe stood there smiling. I smiled back at him, but it was crooked and fearful. Joe stepped inside and I closed the door. "So, George's wanted to show me something like stones?" Joe said. "Oh yes, come on, Joe." I led Joe into the kitchen, and I pointed at the 3 stones. "What is this, and what happened to your face?" Joe asked, pointing to my cheek. "It's a long story, and I'll tell you on the way to Dorft Landsky," I said, pulling out a chair for Joe. Joe sat down by the table, his eyes fixed on the stones. "A couple of painted rocks? What's the catch?" Joe asked, sweat starting to creep on his forehead. "This is," I said, sitting down beside Joe. "I'm not sure if I want to do this, but..." I pushed the 3 stones together and the portal immediately formed, and I sighed deeply, as I was sucked headfirst into the bright red light. Beside me I could hear Joe yelling my name, but that soon faded away. I turned the last corner and saw the Shadow Earth's bright orange sky. I fell out of the exit and hit the desert earth in a cloud of dust. My already dusty shirt was now dirt black and tattered. I got up just in time to dodge the falling Joe, who also disappeared in another dust cloud. Joe was thrashing around in the dirt, his eyes snapped shut, just as mine had been. He was silently calling out my name. "Come on, Joe, get up," I said. Joe snapped open his eyes and he looked around with fearful wonderment. I helped him up and Joe quickly brushed off the dust, his eyes still rolling this way and that like an owl's revolving head. He also winced, and without a word, he pulled a huge red thorn out of his left shoulder. His gray t-shirt immediately started to spot red. He then looked upwards as the portal closed up like a sink drain. One last streak of lightning passed overhead before both of us were alone. What is this place?" Joe asked, holding his shoulder. "This is the Shadow Earth," I replied, massaging my aching back. "Shadow?" Joe asked. "This is just like our world, only different," I said. "Like, there's not as good a technology here, and the humans look a little different." "How different? How did Georges get these rocks? What's that building up there? Where's Georges? Where the hell are we?" Joe screamed hoarsely. "Just follow me and I'll tell you what I still don't even believe," I said, turning toward Dwarf Landsky. Joe ran after me, anticipation overrunning him. We walked on as the bright green sun set into the north. At Dwarf Landsky, Georges was leaning against the back entrance, his hair blown backwards, his face pasted with dirt. His shirt was sweat-stained and his shorts were tattered. When he saw us, he smiled and greeted us, wholeheartedly. "So, Joe, how do you like my world?" Georges asked, eyeing me slightly. "It's incredible. I mean, Jim explained everything, and I think this world is so surreal," Joe said excitedly. His left hand stroked his short beard. "What do you mean, your world?" I asked suspiciously. I crossed my arms and tilted my head towards him. "I have a meeting with the king up in Losdor. It's scheduled a few days from now," Georges replied, giving off another toothy grin. "Yeah, Jim told me about that. Isn't that a little off the wall, Georges?" Joe said, and I nodded in agreement. "You'll both be happy I did this in the end. I mean, our own new world. Ha!" Georges said, grinning at me. "Everyone's forgotten about our mishap, but we should stay on our toes for a while," Georges said to me. "But I want to show Joe Dreer. You want to come?" I shook my head. "You two go on, I'll wait until my hour is up. Maybe see the sights," I replied. Georges nodded and led Joe into the entrance, Joe looking confused and excited at the same time. My smile soon turned to a frown. I sighed and slid down the wall behind me until I was relaxing on the dirt. I looked down upon my scratched watch face and even sighed deeper this time. 40 minutes until I would be back in my own bed again. I stared longingly into the orange sky that was now turning blood red as the sun disappeared among the horizon. I gasped and understood the real story about this Earth. It was still Earth, like it or not, and for some reason it was just split into two pieces. Altogether it was the same, but apart each significant life form starts to change and adapt to its own environment. I sprung up. That was it. This was Earth, which at one time was connected to us, but was cut down the middle, if you will, and connected by 3 stones. I walked back into the desert, leaving Dwarf Landsky behind, and the flying machine, which was now taking off from the platform, probably with Joe and Georges as passengers. I gave up on my hike and collapsed into the dirt. I lay my head up against a moss-eaten rock. I rested my hands up against my chest like a corpse. A large bird, the size of my entire leg, perched near my feet. It looked similar to a crow, but it had a red beak. Only the red was dripping off its beak, and I realized the red was blood. I jumped back up, making the large crow take off in a swirl of wind. I turned around in a swift movement to see a large pit dug into the ground. A whole army of crows swarmed around the pit like vultures. My heart froze, and I felt that if I took the next few steps to look inside, my life would change drastically. I was certainly right. Yet I approached it anyway, and I screamed. The birds flew off, blowing back my rag shirt and dirty hair. The pit was filled to the brim with dead shadow people, all slaughtered and bloody. There was also something moving in the crowd of corpses. A living person crouched nearby, a dead woman, gnawing on her purple, lifeless arm. The cannibal looked up at me and snarled, blood dripping from his chin, his yellow teeth deadly and pin-sharp. I turned and ran, the shadow man pouncing after me. With long, heavy strides, I screeched again, my feet shuffling along. My toe caught on a rock, and in an instant my sneakers were pointed into the now purple sky. My back struck the earth and stars exploded across my vision. The last thing I remembered was the shadow thing's cold, slippery claws wrapping around my neck. I sprang out of my bed and hit the floor with a hard bounce. Yes, it was my bed. It was 1:42 in the morning, and I had just been sleeping. A dream. It was all a nightmare. I laughed nervously, and I massaged my forehead, but my hands were running across cloth. I jumped up to my bruised feet, and I ran into my bathroom. In the mirror, my face was covered in blood-soaked bandages, and so was my exposed chest. My left leg was wrapped tightly with an ace bandage, and there was no ignoring the band-aids on my chin and cheek. "No!" I screamed, springing away from my mirror. I ran from the bathroom and swung my robe over my shoulders. I went out of my apartment door and continued out of the building. Georges only lived 2 blocks away in his grandmother's old house. When I had reached George's house, I found all the lights on. I rang the doorbell, and almost immediately Georges answered the door, pale, rugged, and half awake. Jim, thank God. I was so worried. Georges, I'm not over-exaggerating when I say that world is dangerous. Do you really want to be the king of those monsters? I mean, look at my face, I said, coming into his living room. I was going to ask you what happened. Once my hour was up, I had Joe touch my shoulder as I disappeared, so he'd come with me, Georges explained. Since you still had 15 minutes until you get back home, I sent Joe home and I watched some TV for the rest of the time. I heard a crash, so I knew you would come back, and then I saw you bloody, torn apart, muttering under your breath. You were still alive, so I carried you to your house and hoped to God you weren't in traumatic health. I bandaged you up, gave you some medicine, and then I would check on you in the morning, Georges ended. Well, this is what happened, George, I said. I explained my story, and throughout the entire thing, Georges listened intently. Yet it would take more than that to break him. Chapter 8. Law's Door. When I had finished, Georges just nodded and slowly stood up. He made his way over to the fridge and took out 2 beers. He placed one in front of me and sat down. Well, I said, I've looked up this world's history in a library down in Dreer, and what you found, Jim, is a complos. Georges replied, taking a sip of his beer. What the hell is a complos? I asked. When people are executed, their bodies are put in a complos until they are packaged up for a restaurant. Georges said, The cannibal you saw was only a bum who was just trying to get a free meal. So that man wanted to eat me? I asked, unbelievingly. Only a few hours ago I had just been starting to accept that side of the earth for what it was. I was even starting to wonder if something that evil could have come from my earth. No, he was just afraid of going to jail, so he was just trying to, kill you, Georges muttered. They have a strict thing about only eating their own kind hours after they've been dead. Oh, great. Georges, can't you see all... He was trying to kill me? I yelled. Jim, we have people killing each other over here too, do we not? Georges snapped. We have evil, murders, and bloodshed, just like the Shadow Earth. I sat back, laying my palm across my stinging head. Everything was happening so fast. My head was spinning. I could feel every stinging cut, thumping bruise, and pulled muscle in my back. I was in so much pain, and it hadn't even started yet. Georges sighed and sipped his beer again. He set the beer down slowly and looked intently up at my sculpted face. He looked away again and finished off the can. Look, Jim, I know this could be dangerous, but in 2 days we're meeting King Jabad, and I'm not going to back out now, Georges said. I can't argue with you, George, because obviously it's not working, but just hear me out, I began. Think about this. Destroy those stones. Please, won't you just sleep on it? I asked. I will, Jimbo, but you look more tired than I am, so why don't we both sleep on it, he said, pointing to the couch. Georges said goodnight and went off to bed. I took my unopened beer to the couch and chugged it in just 30 seconds. I belched and collapsed into the couch. Oh God, what next? I woke up to the smell of bacon and my stomach growled hungrily. I got up and made my way to the kitchen, where the yawning Georges was hovering over a frying pan. Hello, Jim, nice night, Georges asked, dripping some soggy eggs onto a paper plate. All right for a couch, I'm starved, I replied. Here, Georges said, handing me the plate. And Jim, do you know what happened to my kitchen window? No, I said, scarfing down the eggs and bacon. Georges fixed himself a plate and brought over 2 mugs of coffee. He gave me one and drank deeply from his own. Take those bandages off after breakfast and I'll put some liquid Band-Aid on it. Georges bit off a piece of bacon. Let's hope nothing's infected. I sipped from my coffee and looked up at him. So, Georges, what have you decided? I asked. Georges didn't answer at first, but he didn't even look up from his plate. He took a bite of egg and then slowly looked into my worried eyes. You know, I can't let this opportunity go. I'm sorry, Jim. I'm drunk on my own sense of power, Georges replied, taking another swig of black coffee. I sighed and did the same. Okay, Georges, but I'm hesitant on this whole plan. I'll have to pass, I said. I got up from my chair to leave. No, Jim, I need you, Georges said. He sprang up and caught me around the arm. Joe is all for the idea, but he's not my right-hand man. I can't rely on him. Without you, my plan is crap. I stopped and looked over at him. His eyes were pleading and his grasp was persistent. Let me think more about it, okay? I'll let you know tonight, I said. Georges beamed at me. Before I left, he pulled off my bloody bandages and sprayed me up with the liquid protection. He gave me another strip of bacon and I was on my way. I went home, took a shower, and put on some nice clothes. I thought I'd go visit my girlfriend Amy. At the time, she was going to move in with me at the end of the week, so she was probably still packing. I hopped into my car and drove down 3 miles to Amy's apartment building. Outside, she was lifting a large stereo onto a pickup with a friend behind the wheel. I pulled up and she waved to me. I came out of the car and she kissed me on the lips smoothly. She hugged me and waved goodbye to her friend. Where have you been? I've left like 100 messages, Amy said. Amy was a beautiful woman. She had chestnut brown hair and a well-sculpted face. She also had green eyes you could get lost in. Suddenly, Amy looked curiously up at me and took off her heavily tinted sunglasses so I could see her lovely eyes. She gasped and wrapped her hands around the sides of my face. I winced slightly. "What happened to your face?" Amy yelled, kissing my bruised cheek. I thought desperately. I definitely couldn't tell her my horrific secret. George's didn't even have to tell me not to. It was too dangerous and I would look insane. So I came up with the next best thing. "Oh, this? I was bike riding up in Red Rocks and I took a little spill down a rocky slope," I lied. But it sounded truly nonfiction. "Oh my God, and you didn't call me? When did this happen?" Amy asked worriedly. "Oh, yesterday. I didn't call because it was really nothing," I said shakily. "Well, I would call it something. Call me next time," she said, and she kissed me again. "Come on in. You can help me move." Well, I had turned off that ticking time bomb, and then I was off with Amy. But there would be a lot more mines to mark my ever-winding road. I was upstairs helping Amy lift up a very heavy table when the cell phone on the table rang ear-splittingly. I screamed, startled. I almost dropped the table right onto Amy. I slowly set down the large piece of wood and picked up the chiming phone. "Hello?" I said, clearly into my phone. "Jim, what the hell are you doing?" Georgia said through the receiver. "What are you talking about?" I asked dumbly. "It's nearly 4 o'clock. You said you were going to tell me what your plan is by then," Georgia said in a whispered hush. "Oh yeah, I've been helping Amy move all afternoon. I guess I lost track of—" "I don't care. What's your decision?" Georgia snapped. "Georges, I don't know. I need more time," I replied. "You don't have time. We meet the king tomorrow," he yelled. Even Amy heard this, and she looked up in interest. I turned my back on her and whispered shakily into the phone. "Fine, Georges, but if this plan of yours fails, we let it go. Don't press on about it," I said. Yes, of course. Oh, thank God you're on my team," Georgia said excitedly. "Now come over. You're sleeping here tonight. We must meet the king early in the morning," Georgia added. I said goodbye and hung up the phone. "Sorry, Amy, I have to go to George's house pronto," I rambled, creeping around the table. "Why, is tonight poker night?" she asked in a calm manner. Yes, I'm late too." I strided for the stairs. "I'll help you finish moving tomorrow, I promise." Then I was out her door. I got into my car and drove away, leaving a confused Amy standing in the hall, which was blockaded by a large oak coffee table. I drove slowly down the vacant street. For a second, it even looked like that cracked, well-worn concrete had morphed into that dirt pathway from the other world. Shadow people were running by in quick gray flashes. Each time they ran by, they'd hiss through the window, long tongues licking at the glass. Even the red weeds were prying themselves out of the dirt highway like the living undead. I shivered, my eyes rolling this way and that at the hideous creatures. Then Georges dropped out of the sky, bloody and tattered. He smacked into the windshield, and I screamed, my hands twirling my steering wheel like a shipman dodging large crashing waves. George's lips smiled, and his white blank eye winked. I closed my eyes and yelled wildly. Then my car smacked hard into something. It came to a halt, and I was swung forwards. I caught myself and opened one eye. I had hit a mailbox. That was it. And what was so creepy about it was that it was George's mailbox. I had just driven right to George's house with my eyes closed. I backed up and drove into his driveway. I got out and rang the bell. Georges opened the door, beaming, and pulled me inside. Oh boy, was I in for a treat. When I got inside, Joe was scarfing down a microwave pizza. He looked up at me and smiled. A thin drop of pizza sauce dripped from his muzzle. "Hey, Jimbo, ready for our adventure?" Joe said. "Oh, I heard about your fiasco, so let's stay away from the comploses." The 3 stones were there on the table again, and so was the cedar box, the one which felt like it was mocking me, the one I was itching to learn more about. I sat down at the table and smiled friendly-like, to Joe. George came in and looked at me curiously. Jimbo, do you know what happened to my mailbox?" he asked. I woke up to Joe's snores. It was around 2 o'clock in the morning, and I was stuck on the couch with Joe. I rolled over onto my side and tried to get to sleep again. Then the sound of soft footfalls proceeding into the kitchen caused me to snap open my eyes. Then I heard the flick of a switch and the kitchen was suddenly illuminated. I rose my head and peeked over the top of the couch so I could get a view of the kitchen. Georges stood there by the kitchen table, a key resting in the palm of his hand. He was looking down at it thoughtfully before he quickly shoved it into the keyhole of the box. He clicked it open and slowly rose that wooden lid. I craned my neck to see over his shoulder, but Georges quickly pulled whatever it was out of the box and pocketed it into his jeans. He was already dressed, and his hair was still wet from the shower. Georges turned, and I ducked back down into my blankets. The kitchen light flicked out. Georges walked into the family room where Joe and I slept, and he stopped directly in front of the couch. I could feel his steel gaze boring down. "Wake up, you two, it's time," Georges said, and Joe burst out of his slumber. I slowly rose and rubbed my eyes to disguise the fact that I had been awake. "Get dressed, we leave in 10. Then my life changed forever. We were in the shadow world on a land sky due west, towards Losdor. The world was not in complete darkness, but the sky was purple, and there was a moon, but it was the shape of a triangle. It also had a white hue around it. The ride to Lawsdor was about 20 minutes long. Us three were the only people aboard, too. Obviously, the shadow people were not night people. Georgia said they all had a curfew for bedtime. It was 10 o'clock each night. I believe I had fallen asleep because by the time Joe woke me up, we were at the pillaring castle of Lawsdor. The castle looked like one of those baby building block towers stacked in descending order. I marveled at the stone castle, which had one big stained glass window on each block of the building. A beautiful crystal lake separated the Land-Sky Airport from the castle's main entrance. On the subsequent landscape of the rolling green fields, large hawk-like birds circled around in blurry ovals. Once in a while they'd screech ear-splittingly. Georges pointed north, where high-tipped mountains guarded the Lawsdor castle from behind. Snow capped these mountains, which caused me to reflect on the beautiful, majestic Rocky Mountains. As the land-sky began its descent, I got to see a large courtyard sitting atop the hill in front of the beautiful castle. Large stone statues lined the edges of the courtyard. I couldn't make them out because the land-sky turned to the side and it came to a complete stop. The hatchway was opened and the rope unraveled. The blue-suited man beckoned us out of our seats. It was a different man this time, but he looked just as nice. I was used to these people by now, and I let him help me down from the land-sky. Once I planted my feet on the platform below, all three of us stared gapingly at the castle, which was separated from us by a beautiful golden lake. This view was truly marvelous, but behind those stone castle doors was great evil. Chapter 9. The Derringer. The three of us made our way out of the land-sky port and out towards the beach of the lake. We strode across the clean sand until we came to a wooden picket sign that read, Derringer Lake, Danger. What does it mean by danger? Joe asked, running his fingers across the splintered sign. I don't know, but there's an old boat up there, Georgia said, pointing to the shore. An even more splintered, moss-eaten boat was tied to a metal peg. A pair of oars were stacked inside. Well, looks like that's our ride, I said, stepping into the boat. The others followed, but Joe was hesitant. Are you sure this boat is safe? Joe asked, his foot patting down on the base of the boat to check if it was sturdy. Only one way to find out, Georgia said. He untied the miniature boat from the peg. I picked up an oar, and so did George's. We both pushed off from the bank and started to paddle out into the calm water. From the lake, I noticed how far the castle looked from where we were. It was quite big around, which meant it would have taken days to reach the castle if we were on foot. The green sun was just starting to creep out of the corner of the black, steeping mountains. The triangular moon was also starting to disappear behind the land-sky hangar. I took a deep breath and marveled at the beauty of this new world. It was truly a radiant dwelling, despite the creature that nestled there. The mysterious gray mountainside, violet glowing night skies, majestic rolling hills, and the calm rarity of the almost mirror-like lake were breathtaking. Then the lovely drifting silence was torn into shreds by a long blur of greenish-yellow slicing out of the water, like the swing of a knife. The blur struck forward, smashing Joe right across his upper face. He fell backwards, half his flailing body hanging over the side of the rowboat, and the blur halted above our heads, and we saw it was a long, slippery tentacle, around 80 feet tall. It collapsed back into the lake with a spray of water. We both sprang forwards and helped Joe back into the boat. He was wailing in pain, and for good reason. His eye was black, and his nose was gushing blood. A large bruise was already starting to form on his cheekbone. What the hell was that? I asked, tipping back Joe's head. I don't know, Georgia said, looking out toward the lake. Joe suddenly went quiet and spit out a loogie of blood. A tooth was also in the saliva. He looked up at me fearfully, one eye literally smaller than the other. Georges, pick up the oar. We're rowing back, I said. Georges looked back at where we had come and shook his head fearfully. No, we've already gone at least halfway. Let's just finish it. George, no, it's too dangerous, I yelled, pointing at the semi-conscious Joe. But Georges had already made up his mind and started to paddle forwards. All I could do was follow suit. We both were paddling hard, so the boat was moving on at an alarming speed. I actually started to think we'd make it. Wrong. The tentacle shot out of the lake and smashed into the water in front of our boat. A large wave swept across the three of us, and we all fell to the back, soaking. Another tentacle shot up, then another, until the boat was surrounded in a cage of flapping tentacles. Then the water in front of us parted, and a large bulge erupted from the lake. It was a head with red eyes full of malice. A gaping mouth came into view, with rows and rows of pearly teeth. It looked similar to an octopus, only its head was misshapen, and strings of black hair fell across its scalp. The thing moaned at us and seemed to smile. The head rose, and we could see its 50-foot-tall, muscular body towering above our boat. There were 12 tentacles on each side of his body, giving it a total of 24. I yelled out as one slimy tentacle shot past my cowering head and wrapped around Joe's exposed neck. With one gut-wrenching tug, Joe was up in the air. His hands clawed at the tentacle and his feet kicked at the empty space. Then the tentacle recoiled and the flailing Joe was underwater. And the creature was too, gone in another large wave which swept me head over heels. Georges darted to the side of the boat and I did too. Joe's screaming, dying face cried up at us as he was dragged deeper downward. Georges gave me a scared, hopeless look, then dove down into the lake. "No!" I screamed, my hand reaching out to his fading legs. I fell back into the boat, tears coursing down my face, shivering arms wrapped around my shoulders. My two friends had to be dead. There was no way that creature hadn't already ripped them apart. Now I was next. Well, if I was going to die, why not now? I was just about to dive down when I heard a large bang and the screech of the creature. The lake immediately started to turn red. The tentacles were even starting to float to the surface. Then George's head popped out of the water, and so did Joe's unconscious one. I helped Joe up and then George's. "How'd you kill that thing?" I asked. "With one of the paddles," Georges said, throwing back his wet hair. "Stuck it in the eye." I looked to the corner of the boat and saw only one paddle was there, but that tale sure didn't sound logical. I thought I had seen that paddle wash away when the wave hit us. I also had heard a loud bang, like a garbage can hitting a brick wall. What was Georges hiding? Chapter 10. The King. We dragged Joe onto the beach and we both collapsed onto the sand. It was 20 minutes later and we were dead tired. I was soaked and now sand was sticking to my clothes. My face was sunburned and my lips were chapped. I would have slept there all day, but Georges dragged me to my feet and splashed water on Joe's face. Joe slowly woke up and Georges helped him up too. I looked up and saw the castle looming ahead of us in a thin stream of fog. All that separated us from the king was the courtyard, which housed all of the stone statues. Georges and Joe walked up the small staircase that led to the courtyard. I ran up next to the shivering Joe and I patted his shoulder. He looked over at me with a dazed expression. He smiled forcefully and looked forward again. The courtyard was truly wondrous. We saw statue after statue, several on each side of a neatly kept gravel path. The path would finally lead up to the steel gates of Lawsdor Castle. Each statue was of a past king of this world and some depicted great wars or battles. One statue had a shadow creature stabbing a great walking and talking mountain. The mountain had red slits for eyes and a cave-like mouth with stalactites and stalagmites for teeth. I caught up with the others, who were all the way up to the gate. They were both staring at a lone sculpture close to the wrought iron bars. When I got up to the statue, I understood. The sculpture was of a shadow person in long blowing robes. Well, half of the shadow person, anyway. One half of the man's face was sculpted just like a human's. A human nose, an ordinary eye, not yellow, and a human cheekbone. This wasn't what stunned me, though. The statue's arm was frozen outwards. His hand was the same, too. One half had the long nails and the pale rough skin. On the other side of the hand were my regular fingers and nails. In the hand was the earth, but it was split down the middle. It was separated, and the two halves were connected by a colorless rainbow. One half was cracked and black, the other plentiful and healthy. "Is that supposed to be our Earth?" I asked, looking at the destroyed half. "Could that rainbow be the stones?" I don't know. Let's hurry, though," Georges said, checking his watch. "We only have 10 minutes until we go back." Joe and Georges approached the black gate. I gave one last look to the statue and then followed. Somehow the shadow people knew about our Earth. Was that possible? Georges pushed a wooden button on the gate and it swung inward. We all gave each other one excited look before continuing onwards up to the oak wooden doors of the castle. Right as we approached the doors, they creaked open and a well-armored shadow man stepped forward, a wooden spear held at his chest. "You're the 11 o'clock appointment, are you not?" the man growled, eyeing me suspiciously. "We are," Georgia said, stepping forward. "Come," the man said, and he led us into the heart of the mansion. It was magnificent. Glass chandeliers and wide paintings of past kings decorated the walls and ceilings. The guard took us through many different passages and rooms. There was a gallery full of miniature statues and glass sculptures. There was a floor-to-ceiling fireplace which had a roaring fire. We passed by a room with cages full of wondrous creatures I wanted to learn more about. There was a room completely dedicated to a huge bookcase covering all the walls. A hallway had many different foreign instruments and masks decorating the walls. One mask looked exactly like a human face, and once again I shuddered. We walked up cascading stairwells and slid across overly polished marble floors. We tiptoed across a room with grass and wild weeds growing out of the floor. One giant weed hissed at me and then split in half. Then a new one grew in its place. We walked for what seemed like hours until the guard led us to a brightly orange ceiling-length door. "The king will see you now," the guard said, and he opened the door by just touching it. We only had 5 minutes left, so we quickly got inside. We all expected a large arena-sized room, like the other ones, but this one wasn't much bigger than my bedroom. The walls were blank and so were the ceilings. All there was a pale old shadow man sitting on an oversized throne. He wore a dazzling jeweled crown, and he wore a silk robe. Wrinkles wore down his face, and somber eyes looked up at us. Georges stepped up to his throne and pulled out a folded wad of soaked pictures. He held them up to the king and kneeled in front of him. The king's grotesque greenish hand took the pictures and curiously looked at them. I could see his black iris shrink into focus and his curling black nails raking across the photos. "Please, your majesty, I would like to make a proposition," Georges said. He licked his lips nervously and gave me a soft glance. "What is this place depicted on these shiny parchments?" the king asked. And just when Georges was about to answer, the king focused on us. "Please, I only see one person at a time." Georges looked back at Joe and I and gave us a pleading look. We both stepped outside the open door, and it slammed behind us. Inside we could hear George's muffled voice and the king's soulful one. Joe gave me a worried look and I returned it. Then his nose began to bleed and he started to get dizzy. I helped him to the floor and I tilted back his head. The guard looked down on us and growled. His yellow eyes pulled back into slits. He brandished his spear. "Don't you two look different? You kinda look like that statue outside. When I look at you, I see trouble." I shook my head fearfully and dragged Joe to his feet. We both turned the corner, the guard starting after us. Once we had gotten away from the guard, we sprinted down the hall, Joe at my heels. Once I looked back to help Joe, I saw the guard standing at the end of the hall, spear outwards, eyes aimed straight at us. He started his pursuit. Chapter 11. The Dungeon. Joe and I fled down the hall. We sprinted into a room which was empty except for a staircase leading downwards. We jumped down the stairs, our heads spinning. Once we were down at the bottom, we sprinted into another room. I shut the door behind Joe and locked it without fumbling. I led Joe across the room, which looked like a garage for cars. It was also empty. At the end of the concrete room was a hatchway in the floor. I opened the door and let Joe slip down into it. I heard Joe scream as he dropped through what sounded like 100 feet down into the chasm below. I heard a loud crunch and then silence. "Joey!" I screamed, but there was no answer. Then the room's doorknob turned and the door clanked back and forth. Then I heard snarling and the clicking of metal. It sounded like keys. "Open the door, Askrals. I have a key, and if I have to use it, there's no stopping me from slicing you open," the creature screamed. There was a long pause, and then the sound of metal sliding into the keyhole. I looked one last time into the black pit, which seemed to go downward into eternity. I took a deep breath and slid into this dark pit. The trapdoor snapped shut behind me, and I could faintly hear the room's heavy wood door bang open. I screamed out and could hear my own voice swirling around me, bouncing off the dry dirt-caked wall. That was all I remembered. I didn't even remember hitting the ground below. Once again, I fell unconscious, but it was more like falling into sleep. Joe shook me awake, his clammy, ice-cold fingers patting my flushed cheeks. I got up to my aching feet and looked around the dungeon. And yes, it was a dungeon. Rusted, bloody chains hung from the ceilings, and there was many severed heads on the soaking floor. Also, there was faint chewed and gnawed meat scattering this way and that. I knew this was not a jail. My thoughts were confirmed when a skeletal creature with tight blue skin bounded out of the darkness. Rows of jagged teeth protruded from its oversized lip. 2 beady green eyes stared down at us. Then the creature leapt from its long bony haunches. Its 4-fingered hand clawed through the air and caught us both by the chests. We struck the muddy wall. The creature screeched like a banshee. Then it sprang at us again, its claws coming downwards, jaw opening alarmingly wide. The thing's fat, short tongue lolled out. Blood and saliva spun out of its open mouth. The eyes extended 3 times their size, revealing large brown pupils. Then my eyes tinted red, then orange, then blue. The left arm of the thing caught around my neck and squeezed. The face of the creature came within a breath's length. It smiled at me and was about to bite into my purple face before I disappeared into the portal. I was whisked away from that creature. Then I saw the long, bony thing spinning after me, Joe clasped tight to its chest. He looked dazed and distant. Blood was trickling out of his ears and nose. The thing smiled at me before all 3 of us were spit out of the portal and into George's kitchen.